The war in Iraq is seen by many, both on the left and the right.
It was an absolute, utter disaster of epic proportions.
It was a big, fat mistake, all right? George Bush made a mistake. We can make mistakes, but that one was a beauty.
Over its course, the Iraq War cost America roughly $2 trillion, or $8,000 per taxpayer. But more importantly, it also cost not just the lives of thousands of Americans, but also the lives of hundreds of thousands of Iraqi civilians. It displaced millions from their homes, directly led to a cascade of extremism and terrorism, and gave us a certain group called ISIS. But despite the clear disaster the war ended up being, it had, in large part, been backed by the public. Even with the high casualties projected, Gallup polls show that over 72% of Americans approved the decision to go to war in Iraq in 2003, compared to 41% for Korea, 60% for Vietnam, and 62% for the previous 1991 war in Iraq. So just how did President Bush and his administration so successfully justify Operation Iraqi Freedom?
My fellow citizens, at this hour, American and coalition forces are in the early stages of military operations to disarm Iraq, to free its people, and to defend the world from grave danger.
Disarming Iraq was apparently the main motivation. Saddam Hussein, the country's dictator, allegedly had weapons of mass destruction, or WMDs for short. For the unenlightened, these are in essence chemical, biological, or nuclear weapons that can be used to inflict lasting harm on a large number of people. Iraq had a bit of a history with WMDs. The 1980s had seen a grueling 8-year-long war between Iraq and its larger neighbour Iran. Saddam had used such weapons, specifically chemical ones, against the Iranians. He also used gas in the 1988 Al-Anfal campaign against the civilian separatist Kurdish population, as well as during a popular uprising in the south of Iraq in 1991. Where he got these chemicals is a long story, but it involves Thatcher's Britain. It was then that same year, after his invasion and subsequent expulsion from Kuwait, that Saddam's Iraq was forced by the UN in Resolution 687 to destroy all its WMD and accept UN inspectors. The first few years of inspection seemed to go on without any major issues, and large stockpiles of Iraqi WMD were destroyed, both biological and chemical. But the regime quickly grew antagonistic to the inspectors, limiting their movements and generally being shady and uncooperative. The inspectors eventually withdrew in 1998 after Saddam Hussein broke off all cooperation, claiming they were simply a front for Western spies. This was with some justification, as the presence of CIA agents was later confirmed by the US, UN, and former inspectors. The United Nations and the United States, however, were unsurprisingly not very happy about this. The incumbent president, Bill Clinton, that same year then ordered Operation Desert Fox, a series of air raids that were aimed at striking any remnants of Iraq's WMD capabilities.
Their mission is to attack Iraq's nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons programs and its military capacity to threaten its neighbors. Their purpose is to protect the national interest of the United States and indeed the interests of people throughout the Middle East and around the world.
A panel of UN experts then in 1999 reported that the bulk of Iraq's prescribed weapons programs has been eliminated. But they warned that if weapons inspectors were kept outside Iraq, the risk that Saddam might reconstitute his programs would grow, and the initial work of the inspectors would be jeopardized. And so the situation didn't really develop substantially from this until...
Holy shit,
It goes without saying that the atrocities of 2001 brought about a seismic shift in American domestic as well as foreign policy. Violence, war, and terror on this scale was something that happened in faraway countries abroad, and Americans had not experienced anything like it since Pearl Harbor in 1941. And so, in his State of the Union address of January 2002, Bush made his position crystal clear when it came to
States like these and their terrorist allies constitute an axis of evil, arming to threaten the peace of the world. By seeking weapons of mass destruction, these regimes pose a grave and growing danger.
The White House adopted the narrative of WMD, seeing it as the most potent line of attack on Saddam Hussein. It was especially powerful after 9/11. If the enemies of America could bring down the Twin Towers with passenger planes, who knows what they could do with anthrax, nerve gas, or nuclear weapons. Some of the more notable examples include a speech by Dick Cheney, then Vice President, where he claimed that
Simply stated, there is no doubt that Saddam Hussein now has weapons of mass destruction. There is no doubt that he is amassing them to use them against our friends, against our allies, and against us.
Even Colin Powell, the Secretary of State, someone who had always been a staunch critic of war with Iraq, going back to the first Gulf War, eventually got on board. At the UN, he gave a damning case for invasion, based on Iraq's non-compliance with disarmament, backed up by
sources, solid sources. These are not assertions. What we're giving you are facts and conclusions based on solid intelligence.
But of course, despite all this, no weapons of mass destruction were ever found.
Those weapons of mass destruction got to be somewhere. Nope, no weapons over there. Maybe under here.
Whether the Bush administration intentionally lied about WMD or not is still hotly debated, but there are certainly cases where they cherry-picked, exaggerated, or outright contradicted what the intelligence is saying. For example, in 2002, Bush declared that Iraq had a massive stockpile of biological weapons capable of killing millions. Yet in 2004, George Tenet, the former CIA director, noted that the CIA had informed policymakers it had no specific information on the types or quantities of weapons agents or stockpiles at Baghdad's disposal. Bush had seemingly simply made up this fun fact. There is also the story of aluminium tubes that the Iraqis were sourcing, which were, according to Condoleezza Rice, then National Security Advisor, only really suited for nuclear weapons programs. Yet this was precisely the opposite of what nuclear experts at the Energy Department were saying. They argued that it was very much possible the tubes were for non-nuclear purposes. The UN-chartered nuclear watchdog also concluded that they were most likely being used for conventional rockets. Lastly, even over in Britain, Intel reported there was only sporadic and patchy evidence of Iraqi WMD, and that there was very little intelligence relating to Iraq's chemical warfare program. But what really made Saddam Hussein public enemy number 2, after bin Laden of course, was the constant conflation of him with Al-Qaeda and 9/11. When Bush declared his war on terror on the 20th of September 2001, he'd not just declare war on Al-Qaeda, he also made it clear that the US would make no distinction between terrorist and sponsor of terrorism.
Our enemy is a radical network of terrorists and every government that supports them.
So if Iraq had anything to do with 9/11, military action would be hard to question, like it was with Afghanistan in 2001. But just 10 days after the Twin Towers collapsed, Bush's classified presidential daily brief read that there is scant credible evidence that Iraq had any significant collaborative ties with Al-Qaeda. In George Tenet's 60-minute interview, he also explained that we could never verify there was any Iraqi authority, direction and control complicity with Al-Qaeda for 9/11 or any operational act against America, period. It made no sense in any case. Saddam Hussein and Osama bin Laden were on opposite sides of the ideological spectrum. The Ba'athist regime of Iraq was brutal and tyrannical, yes, but secularist and apparently socialist. Bin Laden, on the other hand, was an Islamist who viewed even the Saudi theocracy as insufficiently Islamic and called Saddam and his associates infidels. In fact, according to John Nixon, the lead CIA interrogator of Saddam once he was captured, the dictator saw his biggest threat as being Sunni extremism, like Al-Qaeda. He wanted the US to realize Iraq could be a valuable ally in this fight.
What do you mean? He said, well, I was relieved that finally the United States would now see that the enemies, the people that knocked down their buildings, were the same enemies that I was dealing with here in Iraq and in this region, and that, you know, we both had the same enemies. This would make the United States come to its senses and realize that Iraq could be a valuable ally in this fight.
And yet, despite all this, Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld in late 2002 called the link between Iraq and Al-Qaeda accurate and not debatable. Cheney also claimed that 9/11 hijacker Mohammed Atta met with an Iraqi spy in Prague. He'd go on to repeat the claim numerous times as the nation prepared for war, long after both the CIA and Czechs refuted it. It turns out the story originally came from a Czech contact who had confused two different Mohammed Attas, one a Pakistani businessman and the other a 9/11 hijacker. But taking a more scientific approach, speech analysis of Bush has found that he successfully framed the conflict as an extension of the war on terror, and that the administration consistently connected Iraq with 9/11. While Saddam did have a track record with terror, namely the compensation of Palestinian suicide bombers' families and the sheltering of Palestinian Liberation Front members, he had nothing to do with Al-Qaeda and nothing to do with attacks on America. Instead of making this clear, the Bush administration exploited the American public's genuine post-9/11 fear of terror to push for their own agendas.
In any of these cases, the price of indifference would be catastrophic.
And they were undoubtedly successful in doing so. A poll cited by the BBC shows that over 70% of Americans wrongly believed Saddam was somehow involved with 9/11. Okay, but even if we assume that the accusations of WMDs and Al-Qaeda links are all
A web of lies.
Saddam was surely an oppressive dictator. He spat in the face of human rights and terrorized his own people, resorting to massacre in the face of dissent. He tortured journalists and civilians alike and limited voting privileges only to members of his own party. Removing him would free Iraqis and help bring democracy to the Middle East. Yeah, that's not how this really works. Not only did bombing Iraq with democracy completely backfire, directly helping to create one of the most anti-democratic groups imaginable, there is also the fact that the list of the world's dictators is unfortunately virtually endless. If the war is primarily motivated by Saddam Hussein's gross violations of human rights, why didn't we see a war in Iran, North Korea or Myanmar? Why did the US remain a close ally and arms dealer of Saudi Arabia and Israel? Yes, this is verging whataboutism, but the point still stands. More important is the fact that the US largely unilaterally made the decision to go to war. If it was so fussed about the rule of law and justice, why did they invade without approval from the United Nations? In any case, whether Saddam's human rights record alone justifies war largely depends on your views. But personally, I think this argument is a prime example of American exceptionalism. It should not be the United States' right to unilaterally dictate who deserves to be overthrown and who doesn't, especially when it itself uses enhanced interrogation techniques and props up autocracies. The Bush administration sold Iraq as a self-defense measure and as an extension of the war on terror, all underpinned as a crusade for liberty. Yet the justifications were, at best, exaggerated, and at worst, flat-out fabricated. Forget Donald Trump, you could say that these were the real pioneers of 21st century fake news. What their real motivations were behind all this is largely up for debate. Some would say they were just incompetent, and others ill-intentioned. Whatever the case, hopefully this failure serves as a lesson to future policymakers and the American public. But even if it doesn't, it will certainly teach future autocrats to never, ever give up their WMD.
Saddam Hussein, Saddam Hussein, Saddam Hussein.